Hello everyone, it's Alice at Welldoing, and today I'm talking with Jo Love, who is a trainee psychotherapist, an author, and also a long-term therapy client. So thanks, Jo, for spending some time with me. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's so lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. So your book is brilliant. It's called Therapy is Magic, and it's a really great guide for people who might not know where to start with therapy. And I was wondering about magic in the title, because it conjures up ideas of potions and spells, but I don't think that's what you mean.
No, such a good question. Really great to start with. So we had, when you go through the book pitching process, I had a few publishers who were like, we might need to change the title, because that was the title had been in for a long time in my mind, because people might think that it is about spells and incantations and mind, body, spirit stuff. And it's not. But I was like, no, therapy, and the phrase therapy is magic came from me trying to show actually my social media channels what therapy was like, but I couldn't take my camera and my phone into the therapy office. So I devised this way of doing it, which was to sit before, those moments before you go into a therapy session and just talk to camera about how I was feeling. 20 seconds, 10, 20 seconds on, oh my gosh, I don't have anything to say, or I'm feeling this, or I'm feeling that. And then I would come out and I would do a little debrief, quite boundaried, quite high level, not the whole session, but just we talked about this, or I talked about my mother-in-law, or I talked about, all these different things. But I would often find myself over and over and over again coming out, and that feeling of like the weight physically being lifted from your shoulders, or like I always think of myself like I'm a big pressure valve, and I've gone into therapy and someone's just turned the knob, and I get that feeling. So I would find myself time and time again talking into my phone saying, therapy is magic. It's magic, knowing full well it is not magic. So yes, the title of the book is Therapy is, and there's an ellipsis, so ... magic. And I was really quite adamant that those 3 dots needed to be in there, because the whole, as you've read the book, like the first half of the book is therapy is ... and all sorts of things that couldn't be further from magic, like awkward, uncomfortable, hard, all the things, because therapy feels like magic at times, but it also feels hard. It also feels uncomfortable. But yeah, I make great pains to say multiple times throughout the book of like, there are no spells, there are no incantations, there's no waves to wands, there's no magic quick fix at all in therapy. There's no fixes. Some people might argue there's no fixes at all. It's about learning what's there and accepting what's there. But it feels like 2 strangers sitting in a room, 50 minutes of time, something happens. And to the point, and I could talk about this for hours, but to the point where I'm now training to be a psychotherapist as almost part of the book writing process. I was like, I love this so much. I need to do more. So, and my lecture last week was, the lecturer was saying, talking about the neuroscience behind therapy, which I talk about in the book a bit as well, and like how it actually works. And he was like, but really, it's just magic. Even the professionals think there's just something in there that when it really works, when 2 humans click, when you find the right therapy, the right therapist at the right time, it's amazing. So yeah, I think that's answered your question.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm completely on board. And maybe you can tell us a bit about your therapy journey, because you write really well about moving from a place of kind of supporting you with quite challenging, severe mental health problems to now you're treating it more as a self-care and self-development, which I think is really important to make.
Yeah, totally. And it's something that I sort of wish I'd known a bit earlier. Like I found myself in therapy for really big crisis points in my life. And I talk about those in the book, and I'm really honest and open about what kept landing me back in therapy. And I also talk about how a lot of those experiences weren't brilliant. And for many different reasons, and I explore all the different reasons, some of which are totally on me, not being ready. But yeah, I kept sort of finding myself. I think I describe it in the book of like, it was like therapy kept holding out its hand to offer me the support. And I kept sort of trying to do it, or kind of missing, or not getting the right therapist, or not getting the right therapy, or just not quite working, until I found the one. And the one, I call her the one in the book, she really changed. I felt the magic of it. I felt what it should feel like. And it completely, that completely changed my life. I definitely now see it as part of my toolkit. It is my mental health toolkit. And I don't go for my mental illness currently, but I go for my mental wellness. And it's something that I just wish I knew had been available. And a lot of people talk about, how to, what do you go to therapy for? And we do often find ourselves in therapy because of these crunch points. But actually, people who have longer term therapy, it is just part of for me anyway, part of, and I know other people, staying mentally well. It is, and I didn't know that. And also, I should say, even when I was dealing with a mental health condition or difficulty at that point in time, this is why I started doing my little Instagram stories before therapy, because I wanted to show that, yes, I'm in therapy for postnatal depression, or I'm in therapy for my depression, or I'm in therapy for a mental health condition. I don't go in and sit and talk for the entire 50 minutes about my postnatal depression. I could be talking about my mom. I could be talking about childhood stuff. I could be talking about the fact that my husband won't pick up his socks from the floor. I could be talking about all these different things that actually, or like the world crisis, or whatever, because it's whatever I wanted it to be for me. And I had that moment. And when I shared it on social media, a lot of people said the same, like, oh, like, even if you're going for something, you don't need to talk. You can if you want to, but you don't need to talk about that something. It's whatever is relevant to you in that day, in that moment, in that space. And that's okay.
And it's amazing how everything can tie itself together eventually.
And it's often all linked, even if you don't think it is. Yes.
So the relationship, obviously, finding the one is key. At Welldoing, it's a massive part of our ethos. We really try to help people find the right person for them, because it's so important. So I was wondering if you had any advice for people about what they should look for in terms of a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it is so hard because, as like you say, it is, and it has been shown to be, the relationship is the biggest driver of change and what will make therapy kind of work. But how do you, if we're trying to think about that in other relationships, how do you quantify or identify like what it is about that relationship that works? It's so hard. And honestly, I wrote a few chapters on sort of exactly this. Like, there's a whole chapter on the first session and trying to work out if this person might be somebody, but also like trying to work out what kind of therapy and what kind of therapist. But I think it's one of those things that, obviously your platform's great, and there's a certain amount of like having to look for a qualified, making sure that you're looking for a qualified therapist, and those sort of hoops that you should be going for, and making sure people are registered with professional bodies. But at the end of the day, it's more, it's less like a list. So it's a really hard question to answer. But I think particularly when we think about that first session or that first phone call that you have with somebody to set up a session, or even just looking at their bios, but definitely in that first session, it's like, are you comfortable with that person? And it might, even if it is uncomfortable what you're talking about, is this person that potentially someone who you might trust? Because again, sometimes you feel like you come in and you have to give them, you have to emotionally vomit on them, you have to tell them the entire life story, and you end up leaving just feeling a bit rattled and like vulnerability hangover, like, what have I just done? It's more that first session. I say to like, take your time, ask all the questions. It is a relationship, and it's not like they're the expert. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book is trying to break that down and show that it is more equal, and they don't have all the answers, but they do have a little bit more knowledge about what might be happening for you. But I think it's about that feeling like they could be somebody who you might be able to open up to. And I notice my language, there's like, it's quite hedging there, but it's that because you've got to listen to your gut, and you've got to listen to, how you're feeling when you're sitting in that chair. Yes, you're talking about like deeply uncomfortable stuff that you may have never ever talked about before, but how did they react to that? How do they make you feel? So it's a bit intangible. It's like very difficult to tell somebody what it is that they should be looking for. But yeah, it's do you feel heard? Do you feel seen? Do you feel understood? Do you feel like, yeah, those things that are there? And if they're not, then totally okay to try somebody else.
Yeah. So what would you, because therapy doesn't always go exactly how we want it to. I mean, and you share your bad experiences. So what would you say to somebody who'd had a bad experience? Would you encourage them to try it again?
Oh, totally. And I think that's one of the first, I'd say just don't write it off. I think that's one of the most frustrating things. I'm sure you agree, but that I hear of like, oh, I tried it and it wasn't for me. And a lot of people get pushed into CBT because that is what is mainly on offer through the NHS. And that's not me throwing shade at CBT, but it's not for everybody, and it's not for everything, and it's not for every time in your life either. And also it is very different to a lot of other talking therapies in some ways. So people think, oh, I tried that and I didn't like it, and therefore that is therapy. Or I went and it was like a real analyst, blank slate, and that wasn't me, or the opposite. And it's one of those things like there are so many different types of therapy out there. There's so many different therapists out there, and also what we're dealing with at different points in our life. So I would just say it's almost as unique as like anything else. Like, we're humans, and it is like about two humans, but it's something that I strongly believe that everybody can benefit from. Absolutely. It is about timing and right time for you. And if you're not open and you don't want to change, or you don't feel comfortable enough opening up, like, it is not going to work for you. But I would say, trial and error, kiss a few frogs. And that is totally okay. It's okay not to click with somebody. It's okay to not click with the type of therapy, but it doesn't mean all of therapy. I'm trying to think of an analogy, like, I can't at the moment, like off the top of my head, but like, would you write off the whole of, I don't know, food because you tried pasta and you don't like it? I mean, that's probably we need like emotional nourishment and support, and as humans, that's we know, anybody who knows about neuroscience and like way our brains are wanting to connect with other humans, and how it can be so healing to do that. But if you don't like spaghetti, you don't eat. So that's how I feel about people who say it's not for them, or have had a bad experience. It's okay. That's okay.
Spaghetti, that's what I want to know. Yes, I agree completely. But I also really empathize with how disheartening, obviously, it is to have like a poor experience, because it can be such a difficult thing for people to do.
I just, on that, I know we probably got something else you want to ask me, but I would say you haven't failed. And like, even if it is, something that feels entirely coming from you, like you can't put your finger on it, that's totally fine. And pretty much every therapist out there will completely understand if it is something that you can't articulate, but everybody knows the importance of the relationship, and that's okay. But honestly, totally, that feeling of failure, like you've done it wrong, or even when you're in therapy feeling like you're not doing it right, that can be a very powerful voice that's not helpful.
So types of therapy, you write about what seemed like a really powerful EMDR experience, actually.
Yes.
And I don't know if you want to tell people a little bit about that, because I think it's getting a lot more attention. We hear about it more now, and great potential for kind of trauma. So
yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, but EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. So it's a bit of a mouthful. So you can see why everyone just says EMDR. And I didn't know the other day, but EMDR until the other day, but EMDR is like the brand name, and there are other eye movement desensitization reprogramming therapies out there, just to confuse everybody, because there's always so many, but basically do the same thing. And it is, for people who don't know, it is a way, so traumatic memories and trauma, okay, it's such a big topic, isn't it? So trauma doesn't need to be capital T trauma, what we think of as like battlefield and life and death situations, or really, you know, what you see in the movies, trauma. Trauma can be pretty much anything that we personally, just because somebody else has had a more, in our cognitive mind, thinking a more potentially harrowing experience, that doesn't stop our body feeling trauma. So trauma is, well, and trauma is stored in our body. It is there. And this isn't woo. This isn't like, this is proven. It's in there. And also the way that traumatic memories are stored within our brains are stored differently to normal memories. So trauma memory, and this is, I don't want to get too far into that because I want to talk about my actual sitting in the chair, having EMDR, but trauma memories are, they're kind of stuck, and they're stuck in that fight, flight or freeze basically. And the EMDR, what EMDR does is enables the memory to be stored like a normal, that traumatic memory to be stored like a normal memory, and processed, which is why, or reprocessing, yeah. Process. So it's utterly bizarre. It's so bizarre, but it works. So it is like kind of the trauma that they do give people who've come back from battlefield, or and it works. So what it does is, and there's slightly different ways and techniques that a therapist will use, but it basically uses eye movement. And whether that's you are looking at something that a therapist is moving, whether it's their finger or something, or what I had was like a little stick of light, like horizontal stick of light, and it looked like Kit from Knight Rider, like that light going dunk, 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 across, dunk, 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 dunk. And she said that she could have made it red to look exactly like Kit, but it was a blue light in mine. And she sort of had it on a little tripod, and it was sort of eye level, and it sat there in the room. And it's sort of a mixture of like exposure therapy. You're going back to some traumatic events and traumatic at times, but they're there and they're talking you through. There's a very sort of set way that they speak, and you're watching the light, and then they stop and they basically ask you what comes up for you. And for me, a lot of it was very body. It's not words. And she said, if it's words, if it's memories, if it's random people, it might not be linked to the specific trauma either that you focus on. You build a mental picture of a specific snapshot in time of something that was really quite difficult to deal with. But it might not be related to that at all, what's coming up. And it was really bodily responses all the time. So I could feel my brain. Like, I've never felt my brain. I've had headaches, but I could feel parts of my brain, and I could feel, it was just bizarre. But also the emotions with it. So it wouldn't just be like I'm feeling my body. It would be like anxiety ripping through me, or I don't think I've ever cried so much in the therapy chair as I did during EMDR. But and it is super tough, but you get to a point where you do this sort of exercise again and again and again, and things neutralize. Things that when you first start off, or as you get into it, is because you're always measuring as well. So they're saying, like, on a scale of 1 to, I think it was 1 to 10, like how activated is your body? How traumatic is this thing? How difficult? How much emotional heat is there? And then you can get to the end and you're like, nothing, like literally nothing. And even maybe earlier in the session or a couple of weeks ago or something, it was huge. It was like off the scale of 10. And it's just it was so brilliant. And I was lucky enough to be able to do it with my own therapist. She was qualified as an EMDR specialist, which was brilliant. I mean, obviously there are people who go and you can go and have a course, but it meant that we could do it really, really slowly. So if some weeks something had come up, because life comes up, and I just needed a talking session, or and things do come up during the course of EMDR. She said this to me a lot, of you might be walking around and suddenly you'll have like a really visceral childhood memory about something. It may be traumatic, it might not be. It might be just some like at some point you just remember your childhood next door neighbor that never did anything, like, nothing. But it can be a bit jarring, it can be difficult. So you've got to really look after yourself in that time. But I really recommend it for anybody who thinks that they might have unprocessed trauma. And that doesn't need to mean life or death stuff. It can just mean some things that are a bit stuck and are affecting you. EMDR is just brilliant, but very difficult.
Yeah, it sounds powerful. Powerful. Therapy can be hard, so there's a kind of readiness aspect from the client, isn't there? So how do you think someone would know they were ready to see a therapist?
It's such a good question, because it can feel so intimidating, like the whole thing, whether you know what's going to happen or not. If you're going in completely blind, or you have, listened to things like this and you've got a sense that there might be some difficult stuff, it's still really scary. And so it almost feels like, how would you ever know that you're ready? I guess if you're in deep crisis and you're really, really struggling with something, it's probably going to be very obvious to you that you're ready. But I sense like your question is more yeah, I think there could be something maybe, but I don't want to bother anybody, but but it sounds a bit hard and a bit difficult, and do I really want to do that? I mean, personally, my experience would say, just try it. I mean, if you don't like it, obviously I'd say try someone else, or try it a little bit more, but no one's forcing you. We all have to be doing it. There is enormous benefit in it. I would say almost it's better to go before you're ready, because life happens, things happen. Obviously I'm very much talking about like longer term therapy here, but there are still accesses, like through iApt, you can still access resources, and if you are very much adamant that you would like to have talking therapy, they do allow that. So but there's also lots of workbooks and resources and things so they don't turn people away as such. You might have a waiting list, but if we're talking about private therapy or longer term therapy, I think it's better to go before you're in deep distress. I have my therapist. When I moved from London to Bath, when I was looking for my therapist here in Bath, there was no major life crisis, there was no huge difficulty, but therapy, like we said at the top, therapy has now become part of my mental health toolkit, as is journaling, as is exercise, as is sleep. Like sleep's a massive one for me, but so is weekly therapy. And so you don't have to get to like this bright line test of, and now you are ready for therapy. It is going and having space held for whatever you might want to bring. Sometimes my therapist is a bit career coach. Sometimes she's a bit mother. Sometimes she's a bit friend. Sometimes she's a bit of all the things. And that's okay. And it's just there as a resource, because life happens and crap happens. And knowing, like just recently I've been dealing with a big personal issue, and it's not a mental health issue, but it's difficulty, and just knowing, okay, Thursday I get to go and talk to Kate about this, that's amazing. So there's no tick box, there's no line, just go, give it a try.
And anyone who is in therapy but they're struggling, what advice would you give them?
Well, struggling can mean like a lot of things. I talk about this in the book of like how to know when to leave, and how to actually leave and not ghost, because I've done that before. Or dump or ghost your therapist is like such a temptation. But could be so many reasons why you're struggling in therapy. I mean, it is really hard, like we've touched on before. Also, as we've touched on, like it could be the type of therapy or therapists. It might be that you're just not quite open to being that vulnerable, because you've got to get really vulnerable. But you've not failed. And like, I think also the thing with therapy that I wish I'd known is like slow progress can still be progress. So you might be struggling, but actually I think anybody who's been in therapy for any length of time will sort of understand, or a longer time will understand, that it might look a bit like this, but actually you're going upwards, you're going round and round in circles, but those circles are actually getting you somewhere, but when you're in it, so it's really good to be able to talk to your therapist about it if you can, because there's nothing better, and they are the best person. They won't try and keep you in. Some people think, oh, they're just going to try and keep me here and locked in. They are going to listen to you, and if you're struggling with therapy, they are the best place, because they might be pushing you too far and too hard. They might be, but you can work together and work it out. But like, there is something in this, like, it's often darkest before the dawn, and therapy, I say with therapy as well, like, it can feel sometimes it can feel like you climb one mountain and you're like, I've got there, I've got to the got there, and then, oh no, there's another whole great big mountain that I hadn't even seen, and I wasn't even aware of, and I couldn't see when I was at the bottom of the other mountain, and then that can happen again and again and again. So yeah, struggling in therapy doesn't, to my mind anyway, doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong or that you need to stop or you've failed. Actually, like, struggle is kind of part of it, and like, pain is unfortunately an intrinsic part of the therapeutic process, and without that, there isn't growth, and there isn't change, and there isn't like that transformational power. So it's uncomfortable, it's hard, you can feel like you're really struggling, but often those are the sessions that move you on and that the most work happens. But I say all that with the caveat of talk to your therapist about it, because there could be so many reasons why somebody's struggling. It might be, and we haven't talked about this yet, but it might be that they're not understanding you. It might be that something in the relationship's not working, or it's very important that therapists, they don't need to be from the same background or culture or religion or race as you, but you need to feel that they understand you, and there could be some of that at play. There's so many reasons why someone might be struggling in therapy, but unfortunately a little bit of struggle. I think they did, we learned about this the other day, there's like an optimum level of stress, and it's not stress in the sense of like your therapist is trying to stress you out, but an optimum level of sort of light pressure that a therapist will be trying to, and this will depend on different clients, and they're able to hold this, and part of what I'm trying to learn to do is learning how to hold that, but to sort of enable that in the therapy room to allow the client to change. So it's quite interesting knowing that has to be in an element in the room.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jo. It's been such a pleasure and such great insights. I'm sure will be really helpful to people. So thank you for giving your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Honestly, it's like this is why I wrote a book about it, because I honestly could talk about it all day. It's my favorite thing to do.
Oh, thank you, Jo.
Thank you for having me.